Shalom and welcome. As you can tell from the title of this discussion, the topic is head coverings. A Hebrew mind follows a thinking pattern that is backwards to our own. We're going to look at a passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and here in this passage is actually a very beautiful example of this type of thinking, where first the topic is discussed and then it is defined in the end. Therefore, in order for you to know exactly what this topic is about, we will start from the beginning to the end of its context and then work backwards. Before drawing conclusions, please listen to the end. Now, let's dive into this chapter. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 1 through 3. Be imitators of me just as I also am of Christ. Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. It is very interesting to note there is from the very beginning an established difference between a man and a woman. And just as the man must be under Christ, so the woman subject to the man. And here Paul is about to define one of the ways that this difference in roles of a man and a woman in subjection to one another will look like. Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. So here's the question: what is that something? But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head, for she is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. I want to make a quick note here. The word uncovered here in the Greek literally means unveiled. It is used one other time in this passage in verse 13 of the same chapter. And another note, there is the word disgrace or disgraces. It is not a sin, but simply a shame. We're going to touch on this a little bit later on. For she is one and the same as a woman whose head is shaved. So here we see the establishment that the lack of this veil results in identity with a bald woman. Who were the bald women of those days in Corinth, and what does this have to do with anything? The bald women of that time, specifically in Corinth, were temple prostitutes. Having a bald head during that specific time meant that the woman is identifying herself as a temple prostitute for the area of Corinth. So lacking this veil that covers the whole head completely indicated a similar identifier with a bald temple prostitute for a lady in that area and that specific time. So again, what is this veil? For if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head. This phrase here, for if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. So, if she refuses to have this veil covering her head completely, then she might as well not have any hair at all and identify with those who are bald. And the latter part of it says, but if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head. Cover her head here in the Greek literally means to cover wholly, that is, veil, cover, hide. So, in order to avoid disgrace for a woman of that time who lacked a complete veil over her head and who did not wish to associate herself with the bald temple prostitutes of that time, she was supposed to veil her head completely. You see, here we begin to see an interesting introduction of a very important aspect that is later going to be defined, the aspect of hair in association to a veil. For a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. Again, this word cover here means to cover wholly, veil, completely, cover and hide. Again, we see the established difference between a man and a woman. One thing that distinguishes one from another is this specific type of veil. Let us read on. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. So my question is, what is this authority that she must have on her head to cover it completely? Is it a cloth, a kippah, perhaps a chador, or maybe even a hat? However, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originates from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman. And all things originate from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Here is the other verse, the same Greek word that we saw in verse 5, uncovered, meaning unveiled. Same exact word here. So, up to this point, we know that this veil needs to cover the woman's head completely, distinguish her as being under the man's authority, and raise her up above all shame. So, what is this veil? Is it a piece of cloth, or is it something else? Let us read on. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? Whoa, Paul, did you just change the subject? No. In fact, he is defining what this veil is. The topic has not changed. But if a woman has long hair, it is glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. Now, suddenly, this veil is very clearly defined as being long hair, which naturally is a shame on a man but glory on a woman. All along, Apostle Paul was addressing the issue of women refusing to have long hair that covers their heads completely. And you may ask, how long? According to these passages, long enough to cover the whole head and also to veil the woman, enough to distinguish the woman from the man. But if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. So now we see that very clearly and specifically the veil is defined. It's not a hat, it's not a piece of cloth, it's not anything along those lines other than the hair, the long hair of a woman that God has given to her as part of her nature. Now, let's take this whole entire context and read it backwards, but properly defining each term based on what we just read and saw. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? Highlighting long hair. But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. Again, very clearly, the covering is long hair. So when you see the word covering or veil, it equals to long hair. Judge for yourself. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Her hair is not covering her head completely. Remember the very original definition of what uncovered or veiled means here. However, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor man independent of woman. For as the woman originated from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman, and all things originate from God. In other words, God is the one who established for a woman to have long hair into her nature. Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority. Remember, that symbol of authority is long hair on her head because of the angels. Now, angels here is in the Greek, the word angelos, which could simply mean messengers. It can describe both the spiritual messengers but also the physical messengers. Us as Christians, we are considered as angelos, as messengers of God. So this isn't specifically something that has to be carried over into the spiritual sense. It can be simply stating the fact that a woman needs to be distinguished from a man so that the messengers, for example, messengers of Christ, when they come by, know which one is which. For a man ought not to have his head covered, in other words, the long hair on his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. It is interesting to note here that men typically find longer hair on a woman more attractive, hence the phrase, the woman is glory of man. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. But every woman who has her head uncovered, in other words, someone who does not have long hair but has short hair, while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. For she is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. In other words, those who are around her will not perceive her as one who is following God's design for hair. For if a woman does not cover her head, in other words, does not have long hair on her head, let her also have her hair cut off. Paul is kind of making a sarcastic statement here about how the short hair on a woman is like no hair at all. A bald head on a woman, specifically in Corinth, if you remember, during that time period indicated her as one out from her husband's authority and in prostitution. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off, or her head shaved, let her cover or veil her head. Here one can draw a natural conclusion. The woman must grow out her hair long enough to distinguish her from a man. Now, what would a woman who just became a Christian, coming out of this whole temple prostitution mess, and she's ashamed to identify herself with her past, what would this woman have to do? If long hair is given to her instead of a veil, and she is lacking the natural veil of her hair, then she was to cover herself with an unnatural veil, which in their culture would have been a long cloth. Therefore, the conclusion from this context is as follows. Head coverings or headdresses of any kind is not a duty for all women, but only for those who do not have a natural veil of the hair that God has given them naturally. Every man who has something on his head, now we know what this something is, it's long hair, while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. So I have a question for you. What about the Nazarene vow? The man or woman who made the Nazarene vow would for a temporary time disgrace their head, specifically with the men here. Again, this isn't a sin. It is simply a cultural shame. We know this because God would not be telling the Nazarites to commit a sin in such a case if having long hair was a sin. So nowadays, this disgrace is not culturally there for us. That same disgrace of a bald head associated with prostitution is not relevant to our area and time. Therefore, if you have no hair or have short guy-like hair, you will not be sinning. To call this sin would be an unbiblical condemnation of cancer survivors. And this was never called sin in the first place. Of course, it is better that long hair would be present on a woman as God has designed it to be, but not all are able to have that. And if you feel ashamed, well, the simple solution would be wearing a veil-like head covering, a hat, or anything of those sorts. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. Traditions. To you. Who is this you? Corinthians. We see the mentioning of this need for a veil only to the Corinthian church. Nowhere else in the Bible does this sort of topic ever come up. This makes me wonder if this was a tradition specifically meant only for the Corinthians and not anyone else. We see clearly that Paul makes the statement here to them, whether it is or not, in either case, traditions are not commandments. Jesus makes that very clear when he rebukes the Pharisees for making their traditions equal to the commandments of God. Traditions are not mandatory in our Christian walks, and the use of a veil to cover short hair is defined by Paul here as a tradition. Therefore, if you feel led to wear a head covering, do not judge those who use their natural, God-given veil to symbolize their subjection to their authorities of God. In other words, those who use their long hair instead of an unnatural covering to cover their head. And here we come to the beginning of this context. Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. Unfortunately, many want to argue against these verses in order to elevate their traditions above what is actually written here. They do their best to make sure that the cultural background and the religious beliefs that they came from is exalted above the context of these words. So I find this verse 16, the verse with which Apostle Paul ended this context, very appropriate for such people. But if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. Thank you for your time in this discussion. Shalom Aleichem. May the peace of God be upon you all. Amen.